tendency to look at things in a sort of a broader, more metaphoric view. And there's something else in here, and that is that when we originally pulled those descriptors out of the data in January that had the start of all of this stuff about the two cities and the problems, there were two separate areas within the model space against that common background.
Okay.
So we had some separation between them, which lends at least to my mind, leads me towards the conclusion that we're actually dealing with a second instance.
In the whole runs, you said that you started to get information in January.
Correct.
How many total runs have you done since January to the last one you just finished?
6, I think.
6. Wow. So that has been, Cliff, a building up of information and data starting 6 runs back.
Correct.
Culminating
Correct.
in what happened 2 weeks ago.
Correct.
Wow.
And it continued to maintain its original form, so to speak, within our model space throughout that period of time. So, I mean, it's terrible to say, but we were somewhat confident that something would emerge.
That is
and
awesome.
again, most of the data seemed to suggest that we were going to get a earthquake period of time prior to the equinox here, because we've had all kinds of planetary alignments that are usually coincident with earthquake activity. And so we were rather calm in thinking that we would have another earthquake strike between the incident of the city going back into the mud and the equinox, which would place it before September 21. However, to really muddy all the waters, we've got these emotional tension values. And our emotional tension values continue to build over the course of the fall and start releasing only in the December period of time, just about the time we get into the Bushista entity running into its wounding.
Yeah, one of our listeners and a good follower of yours, because I've heard you mention the term summer shakes.
Yes.
And meaning earthquakes. Do you still feel that, because I don't think December would be considered the summer shakes, or would that just be basically a continuation of it, and that we should really be checking for it, maybe starting in the summer, meaning now? I mean, because this is really, we're going out of summer now, going into fall. Is that a normal situation that we've had this past summer in your description of summer shakes?
Yeah, that would be true. That's a normal description for us, that the summer shakes were going to be of nuisance and annoyance, but not necessarily catastrophic.
Okay.
And I would agree that our summer shakes was quite clearly from solstice to equinox, and so would end on September 21. The issue with the city sliding down the hill and all the trouble evacuating and all the people literally having to live on roads again there for the earthquake stuff is problematic, because we have a number of hyperdimensional days that suggest, coincidentally, right around the 21st, we have some planetary alignments that are going to put some rather severe stresses on the planet, and we may indeed get a bunch of quakes. If that's the case, then here is a postulate. If we were to hypothesize that we're going to have a city, say in Japan or even in the west coast of the United States, another major disaster, and it strikes due to earthquakes, and the city slides down the hill, and there's perhaps as many as 5 or 10 or 15 million people that are affected directly, again requiring resources and aid and so forth, then indeed that would tend to suggest that it's going to contribute to our building emotional tension. But conversely, within the United States here anyway, and within most of the planet as it ripples out from the United States, the question is, what is our release going to look like in December? Because the emotional tension values that we're building up right now, and everybody that's read any of the 905 or 1105 series, the last 2 series we did, agrees that we really are in this emotional building period. And ever since Cindy Sheehan made her appearance, and that was pretty closely timed with our emotional tension factors rising.
Yeah.
And we're now certainly in an area where there's all kinds of emotions building, even concurrently with emotional releases all over the place. We still seem to be stair-stepping, and a lot of people are feeling it. We're sort of ratcheting up, if you will. That being the case, I would really not be prepared to speculate as to what kind of a release we're going to have in December that would then continue all the way through to June.
Wow.
That sort of makes sense?
Yeah, and it sure does throw up some interesting colored flags, doesn't it? Because if what you have picked up so far... Now, let me back up and throw a whole bunch of ideas and questions at you, Cliff.
Could you speak up a little, too? The phone seems to fade.
Sure. Let me... I'll just crank it up that way, too. Is that better?
That's perfect.
Okay. Yeah. You talk about the two cities, and one, and I forget your exact terminology, but sliding into the ocean or whatever it was.
One went back to the mud,
right.
And the other was seen sliding down the hill.
Sliding down the hill. Were you picking up the information on both cities back in January, or
Correct.
just... Oh, you were? Okay.
Yeah, that came out in the run 105. Now, also you have to understand that the data for that run actually was being gathered at the time the tsunami hit Sumatra.
Yeah,
so
right.
we had this weird situation, right? Here we'd had a mega disaster affecting the whole planet, plates moved, etc., and yet, obviously, instantly, all of our data is polluted because everybody's consciously suddenly thinking about Earth changes, and so we've got to filter all that out. And our filtering had to be adjusted on the spot, on the fly, as we're going through it, much the same way we're having to do now in regards to the other form of Earth changes hitting New Orleans. So at that time, we ended up with a situation where I said, well, from our conscious data, we're getting a lot of this same kind of stuff, but our methodology is our methodology, and so here's what we've got. In other words, 105 was yet one more chance to make a fool of ourselves, because we were going to say that we thought there were going to be two cities that would be damaged this year to the point of 10 years irreparability. Couldn't be repaired for 10 years, may even be abandoned, because we don't really get the word abandoned. It has less emotional content than those things like decades left alone, that kind of a thing.
Wow. What is your gut feeling about that in itself?
About what specifically?
Well, like what is going to be the ultimate with New Orleans? I mean, now we have it, the second city, which couldn't have been Sumatra because there wasn't a city that went into the...
Oh yeah, all of this data, actually, even though the data was being taken out during that period of time, all of our values, of course, were forward-looking. And so they were actually looking into 2005 as opposed to looking back into 2004. We were doing our regular sort of a projection. Wow. So I would think there is another city. There's many, many, many candidates on the planet here because we're, as humans, we're stupid and we build our cities very poorly.
That's right.
And we also choose some really interesting places to put them. But you could easily imagine a scenario whereby, say, a city in the hills of the Sierra Nevadas went sliding down due to an earthquake. Ended up at the bottom of a valley somewhere, and a lot of people are displaced. Well, given the recent example of what FEMA is capable of in all of their grandeur, I would suggest we would have a huge amount of emotional tension building from yet another disaster and yet another totally unprepared state from the Bushista entity. And if that occurred before the equinox, we would certainly go into October with these huge levels of emotional tension building all the way up through November, and then maybe something as strange and perhaps as unpredictable or predictable, depending on which way we want to look at it, as a coup or the indictment of a sitting president and vice president and throwing them into show trials, that kind of thing.
Interesting.
That would work because that would certainly cause 6 months worth of chaos.
Oh, my goodness, yes. Very interesting. I didn't even bring that aspect of it into the equation, and yet that is one of the aspects that people are talking about.
And should such a thing occur, especially with a second disaster, especially with a really poor response, and especially now that, and we're getting a lot of data indicating that we're really close to the edge of the actual loss of the Bush wars of aggression against Iraq, and then consequently we'll soon lose in Afghanistan. military defeats. We've actually lost now. We just don't recognize it yet.
Really? What is that based on, Cliff?
Oh, that's just strictly analysis. They're using the GIAP gap against us in Iraq. It was successful in Vietnam. It was pioneered by a general there called GIAP. He used them against the French. It worked with them, and we were stupid enough to blunder into it. It's kind of like a chess move. Once it's all played out, you're kind of like hosed. We're getting many indicators that that's the case. At a meta level, here's a real overall view to look at it. We invaded the country. We supposedly conquered the country. And yet now, 2 years on, in order to prevent our soldiers from being driven out of areas, we have to bomb bridges. We're bringing back the airstrike.
Saw that, yeah.
That's the same scenario as was in Vietnam. Really soon now, we're going to get some major attacks, and we'll lose the Baghdad airport. From that point on, it's 30 days before we have a fighting retreat.
Wow. Have you picked that up on the road?
We're seeing a lot of indicators of that, yes.
My, isn't that a fine how do you do?
Well, this kind of stuff always happens when you go against the forces of history. We're entering into a period of time where the metadata beyond our militancy level, if we were to go up a level and for lack of a better word, let's use astrological separators, and so we're just coming out of the age of Pisces and we're moving into the age of Aquarius.
Right.
One of the major themes of Pisces, and even on a subconscious level, the fish, is schooling behavior, centralization, authority. One of the meta themes of the Aquarian age is a feminine knowledge giver, decentralization, self-organizing collectives. So attempting to impose our will on a state like Iraq, which was created out of 3 states in the Ottoman Empire, none of the people like each other. They have religious reasons to be fighting each other. Strikes me as a stupid thing from the very beginning, doomed to the inevitable end we're seeing now.
It's a non-win situation, that is for sure.
And Afghanistan is even worse. We had all kinds of moral authority going into Afghanistan, and even that wouldn't, even if we'd left Iraq alone, we would, I doubt we would be the single country ever on earth to successfully conquer Afghanistan. Bearing in mind that they threw out Alexander the Great. They've thrown out every single invading Indian army that's ever decided to go north. They threw the Russians out. They threw the British out at horrific cost. 141,000 British troops and camp followers marched in. 2 marched out alive.
What?
Yeah, 1800s. People got to read history.
Oh, jeez. 2?
2.
Oh, jeez.
And they owned Kabul. They owned everything in that country. The Afghans merely waited for winter to come on in, cut their supply lines, forced them out through a southern retreat, and slaughtered them on the way.
My gosh.
Helps if you can muddle your way through English translations of Arabic history.
Oh, my gosh, Cliff.
Well, let's also think of Baghdad.
Yeah.
33,000 British citizens in a cemetery called the British Cemetery. The last one was placed there in 1921 when they threw the Brits out. And here we are back with Tony Blair doing that stupid karmic echo again.
This is incredible, isn't it?
It's really goofy when you look at it, isn't it?
Well, it's absolute insanity on the part of the people that are trying to, to buck. I don't know if it's history, but yes, it shows up in history, but at least tradition. And is it because, and interesting, all the ones we talked about, it's been basically Christians and Jews against Muslims. What is is that the overriding theme, the bottom line?
I don't know if that's the case, or if people would have you divide if other people would have us divide ourselves that way. Right? Because see, one way of looking at it was the British Empire wanting the trade routes and spice routes, etc., that were inherent, and also the